there was a moment, almost impossible to recognize while it was happening, when childhood shifted. It happened on bedroom floors, sitting too close to the television, waiting for the picture to fully warm up. On early morning bus rides, where backpacks felt heavier than they should, not because of books, but because of what was hidden inside. At lunch tables, where silence didn't mean boredom, it meant someone was protecting something rare. For many of us, that moment had a name: Pokémon. Before it became a brand, before it became an industry, before it became something adults argued about, marketed, analyzed, or monetized. It was simply there. A plastic cartridge snapped into a Game Boy with a soft, familiar click. A sound so small it barely registered, yet somehow unforgettable. A theme song echoing through the house after school, competing with the sound of doors closing, shoes being kicked off, and dinner being prepared somewhere in the background. A folded stack of cards tucked carefully into a pocket, checked again and again, not out of habit, but out of fear. Fear that something rare could disappear without warning. Corners intact, edges safe, nothing missing. In the late 1990s, Pokémon didn't arrive loudly. It didn't announce itself as a cultural force. There were no grand promises, no declarations that it would last, no sense that history was being made. It slipped into our lives quietly, and then refused to leave. By the time we realized what it was, it had already taken over playgrounds, classrooms, television schedules, and conversations that stretched late into the afternoon. It had rewritten what it meant to belong, who you talked to, who you traded with, who you trusted. And for a brief moment in time, children across the world were living inside the same shared imagination, learning the same names, humming the same melodies, chasing the same sense of discovery, without realizing how rare that kind of unity was. Now, in 2026, Pokémon turns 30 years old. 30 years since Pokémon Red and Green first appeared in Japan. 30 years since a small, unconventional idea quietly took root, and 30 years since an entire generation unknowingly stood at the center of one of the most powerful waves of nostalgia ever created, not knowing it would someday be looked back on as something fragile and unrepeatable. This isn't the story of a franchise. It's the story of a feeling, a moment when the world felt simpler, when wonder felt endless, and time seemed to move just a little more slowly than it does now. Part 1. Pokémon began in February of 1996 in Japan, released quietly for Nintendo's original Game Boy. Even then, the hardware felt dated. The screen was monochrome, washed in shades of green and gray. The sound was thin and mechanical, more suggestion than immersion. The system ran on disposable batteries that always seemed to fail at the most important moments. Mid-battle, mid-exploration, mid-discovery, forcing hard choices about when to keep playing and when to stop. By every technical measure, Pokémon should have been unremarkable. And yet, it wasn't. What Pokémon offered was not spectacle, but possibility. The game didn't rush you. It didn't overwhelm you with explanation. It didn't guide you step by step toward an obvious conclusion or reward. You started alone, in a small town, with a single creature, and a vague sense that something larger waited beyond the edge of the screen, unseen, unexplained, but undeniably present. The world felt bigger than you were, and that was part of the appeal. More importantly, the game was incomplete by design. To truly finish it, you needed other people. Some Pokémon could only be obtained through trading. Certain evolutions required a physical link cable connecting two Game Boys together, a fragile, easily disrupted wire that turned cooperation into a shared risk. Progress depended on interaction, on trust, on shared effort. In a time before online connectivity, Pokémon made connection physical again. Two players sitting side by side, two screens facing different directions, one small cable bridging the gap, carrying something that felt more important than data. When the games arrived in North America in 1998, they didn't feel foreign. They felt familiar, as if they had been waiting for us all along. And once they arrived, they spread with remarkable speed, carried not just by advertising, but by word of mouth, curiosity, and a quiet obsession that grew stronger the more it was shared. Part 2. By 1999, Pokémon was no longer confined to a screen. It had entered daily life. The animated series aired after school, its opening theme instantly recognizable. Even to those who claimed not to watch it, the kind of song that seeped into memory whether you wanted it to or not. The lyrics were simple, but the message was clear. Improvement came through persistence. Failure was temporary, and loyalty mattered. Children didn't just watch Pokémon. They lived it. They argued about battles that hadn't even happened yet. They debated which starter Pokémon was superior, defending their choice with the seriousness of experts who felt personally invested. They memorized names, types, weaknesses, and evolutions without realizing they were learning systems of logic, probability, and strategy that would stay with them long after the screen went dark. And then there were the trading cards, thin, glossy, and deceptively powerful. A single holographic card could elevate a child's social standing overnight. Charizard wasn't just a card. It was a symbol of luck, patience, and status, something whispered about before it was ever seen. Trades took on ritualistic seriousness. Deals were negotiated carefully, sometimes over days, sometimes over weeks. Mistakes were remembered for years. Soon, the cards became too powerful for their own good. Schools across the United States and beyond began banning Pokémon cards outright. They disrupted classrooms. They caused arguments. They were stolen, hidden, confiscated. But the bans only deepened their mystique. Pokémon cards became forbidden objects, and therefore, irresistible. Part 3. Outside the classroom, Pokémon saturated popular culture with a precision few franchises had ever achieved. In 1999, Burger King launched the Pokémon Gold card promotion. 16-karat gold, plated cards, sealed inside plastic Pokeballs, offered with kids' meals. The response was immediate. Lines wrapped around buildings. Supplies vanished in days. Parents who had never held a Game Boy suddenly found themselves navigating schedules, shortages, and negotiations on behalf of their children, often without fully understanding why it mattered so much. For many families, this was the first experience with manufactured scarcity. The realization that not everyone could have everything, and that timing, chance, and access mattered more than effort. Pokémon merchandise filled entire store aisles. Clothing, bedding, toys, notebooks, watches, but it wasn't excess that defined the era. It was cohesion. Everyone knew what Pokémon was. Everyone recognized Pikachu. Everyone understood the basic rules, even if they never played. Pokémon became a shared reference point, a cultural language spoken fluently by children and reluctantly, but knowingly, by adults. Part 4. What truly separated Pokémon from other childhood phenomena was the way it encouraged mystery. Pokémon. This was a time before constant connectivity, before instant answers, before updates corrected mistakes or clarified intent. Rumors traveled slowly, and because of that, they mattered more. Stories of hidden Pokémon circulated through magazines, playgrounds, and whispered conversations. Glitches were treated like secrets passed between trusted friends. Mew existed somewhere between myth and fact, just believable enough to keep searching, just elusive enough to never fully settle. Some children believed wholeheartedly. Others doubted, but still searched. Pokémon rewarded curiosity, without promising certainty. You explored not because the game told you to, but because you wanted to know. Because unanswered questions felt exciting, not frustrating. Every discovery felt earned. Every mistake felt permanent. There was no reset button for regret, only memory, and the lessons that came with it. Part 5. As the early 2000s arrived, Pokémon evolved. New generations of games were released, new regions, new mechanics. The franchise continued, successfully, steadily adapting to a changing world and a changing audience. But the world around it had changed as well. Entertainment became faster, attention fractured. Childhood itself became more crowded, more compressed, more scheduled. Pokémon no longer stood alone at the center of everything. And while it never disappeared, it transformed from a shared obsession into a personal one, something remembered differently by each person who carried it forward. For those who lived through the original era, something subtle was lost. Not the brand, not the characters, but the moment. The feeling that everyone was discovering the same thing at the same time, without knowing it would never happen that way again. 30 years later, Pokémon still exists, stronger than ever by modern measures. But nostalgia isn't about success. It's about memory. It's about sitting cross-legged on the floor, batteries nearly dead, trying to finish one more battle before the screen fades. It's about hiding cards in a jacket pocket, hoping they wouldn't be taken away. It's about hearing the theme song start and knowing, without thinking, exactly where you needed to be. We didn't know it then. But we weren't just playing games or watching cartoons. We were participating in a shared moment, one that could only exist once. And when it passed, it didn't disappear. It settled quietly into memory. A reminder of a time when wonder felt effortless, when connection felt natural, and when childhood, for a brief while, felt infinite.